number is 714 today.
714.
That's the current slide number. It's actually extremely helpful for me to have that down there because I also have all the numbers for the slides in my notes so I can keep track of where I am if I ever get lost, which happens on occasion. The screen goes dark. All right, let the whistle, and here we go. All right, now, A.I.C.P. Once again, in case you've forgotten what it was, we are going to have it on the board or on the screen constantly when we go through it. I mentioned this, I think, a little bit last time, but practically speaking, I believe this to be the most important part of our class as we go through this particular acronym. I thought about getting hats or shirts with the acronym on it. Maybe we will at some point. I find it so important, and it really is. And in the sessions following our discussion of our A.I.C.P. acronym, which will take at least 2 sessions, maybe 3, we're going to address 3 specific worldviews, different options that fit into the broad categories we've already talked about in previous lectures. This A.I.C.P. will prove to be our indispensable tool to analyze, and I didn't click it, which means it doesn't work, does it? See, I moved it over there and I didn't click it. It will prove to be my incapability to use technology after 20 years of professional computer work, but still.
How does it do that? I don't know what you're saying.
I don't know. There we go, now it's working. Yes. I have a little bit of fun with my adjectives up there as well. All right. Sessions following. There we go. This will prove to be an indispensable tool to analyze and destroy any and all unbelieving thought. That is not an overstatement. I really mean it. Master this method. Master how this works. And nothing will escape. Once we learn it, the first thing that's going to be on the hit list afterwards is going to be... Yes, there we go. This mighty weapon destroying all unbelieving thought. There we go. First thing that we're going to have on our hit list after we get through this is going to be atheistic materialism. We will talk about that, and we're going to spend a good bit of time on that, partly because I find it to be the most, increasingly, the most common false worldview that we're going to encounter in the United States. There are atheistic materialists everywhere. They're very arrogant most of the time, and they mock everything that doesn't fit into it because we believe in science, they love to say, like that, whatever. But interestingly, though, it's going to prove to be the easiest thing to refute, because it's just so ridiculous. So atheistic materialism will be the first worldview that we run over after we talk about A.I.C.P. And we're going to talk about after that Platonic dualism. Platonic dualism is the chief form of dualism that someone is going to encounter. Plato was the most brilliant idealistic philosopher in the history of the world, many will say, so there's no point really in picking off the stragglers at the end of the pack. Take out the leader, and then everything else will collapse, right? So, now, I consider this particular refutation of Platonic dualism to be important also because, just like in the early church, as we talked about in our church history course that Kip did last time, a kind of Platonism is trying to find its way back into Christian churches today. Many up-and-coming theologians are claiming that we should be Christian Platonists, and that's a quote. They think that's the way we should be in our thinking and in our believing as we seek to understand the scriptures. Some of them have even found positions at prominent SBC seminaries, including Midwestern. But with all due respect to these learned men, they could not be more wrong. You would think the early church and the church history that we have learned, even that's available to everybody, would have taught them a lesson on this. Then we're going to deal with various religious worldviews. Religious worldviews including Islam, which is on the rise. Europe is being taken over by Islam, and it's on the rise here. We're going to talk about Mormonism because of the pseudo-Christianity worldviews that are around it. Mormonism ranks up there pretty high. They come to your door, they knock on it, and they're usually 2 young people, 2 young men in white shirts and black ties with elder name tags saying, "Hi, we're here to talk to you about a New Testament of Jesus Christ." No, you're not. But I would love to talk about religion. They don't come to my house much anymore. In any case, though, before we do any of that, because we're going to hit all of these, and possibly more, depending on what kind of questions we get, before we do any of that, we are going to go through a 4-part, step-by-step way to test, analyze, and refute any worldview. Any of them. I've talked about it on occasion, discussing parts of it. It doesn't really spell a word. Sorry, it's just, there it is. But I find it fairly easy to remember. A.I.C.P. it stands for arbitrary, or arbitrariness. A is for arbitrary. I is for inconsistent, or inconsistency. C for consequences. of a particular system of belief. The logical follow through. If you believe this, the consequences of it are this. And for unbelieving thought, at the end of it, at the end of any kind of internal critique of it, it's always going to be undesirable for any unbelieving thought. Always, always, always. Especially atheistic materialism, which we will get to. P stands for preconditions, so are preconditions of intelligibility. And there are tons and tons of important things underneath this. Some things that we talked about in our previous lectures in passing. We talk about the reliability of our senses, the reliability of our memory, the rules of grammar, the laws of mathematics, the laws of logic, and objective morality. Any of those things are preconditions of intelligibility, meaning these things have to be true in order for something else to be able to be discussed. Laws of logic have to be true in order for it to have an argument or discussion in the first place. What grounds the laws of logic? Why do we have to put our minds? That is our right and wrong way of thinking. Under these four tests, using the grounds, we will expose the quality of this with any unbelieving quote. We'll expose it and it will burn to the ground. Not only that, it's going to burn itself to the ground. It's a qualified to have no foundation for God. And after performing certain test verifications, we can nothing is a worldview and replace their failure of a worldview with the truth of the Christian worldview, starting with the gospel itself. How it not only confronts them after failure, but it should be the only solution, the only way out. Every theological mess they find themselves outside of God. The only solution is Jesus. He's how we come to save us from our sins. He restores the sanity of rationality. Using the A.I.C.P outline will allow you to disarm your opponents with the defenseless. You open our openings so you replace with the gospel, foundation for reasoning, that is Christ. We also want this method because it's important to do more than just memorize examples. I can give you a ton of examples to do, but what I want is a checklist, which will, if the unbeliever engages with you, open the doors to meaningful discussion. So we're going to learn how to ask needed questions to determine if an argument is arbitrary, inconsistent, has unwanted consequences, and if it actually supported and justified the conditions of an argument. As I said, this part of the course is extremely practical. It was very much hands-on. All right. Now that I've cranked up the next let's start. Arbitrary. A. A is for arbitrary. Now, arbitrary. It's not allowed in any philosophical outlook. No, it may not be arbitrary. Why can it not be arbitrary? First, let's define terms. Definitions first, and we can answer that question, right? What does it mean to be arbitrary? Well, that's the second. Arbitrary and inconsistent tend to go together. But to be arbitrary, contradiction is enough arbitrary and inconsistent. Let's do this. Definitions first. The arbitrariness is now over the actual arbitrary. What does it mean? Actually, that's pretty surprising to me, but there will be some further explanation. To be arbitrary is to hold a belief based on random choice or personal whim, rather than any reason or system. That's important. To be arbitrary is to hold a belief based on random choice or personal whim, rather than any reason or system. In other words, this is what I believe. This is what I choose to believe. It's my personal idea. I don't really have a good reason for it. I don't have a system that this is abiding, that this is conforming to. I just want to believe this. That's what it means to be arbitrary. Is to hold a position without foundation. Arbitrary and inconsistent, these two are the top two intellectual sins people commit, and it's everywhere. Arbitrary. Someone believes it without good reason. They have no justifying evidence. This is what I believe, but it's a whim. It is therefore arbitrary. So, if someone is being arbitrary, they're not being rational. They're basically saying that they believe something, how I feel about it on a given day. is still working.
It's not.
But it's not over the button anymore, though. I don't know what slide I'm on. I used the number in the corner.
So the,
Please give me the number in the corner.
Your wife body was good for you, so I was back there.
Oh, okay.
It's better now.
Oh,
All right.
It was not better. Apologies for earlier. Now, arbitrary. Someone would be arbitrary, they're not being rational. They're basically saying how they feel about something on a given day. And it's perfectly fine to respond to an arbitrary claim by saying, so what? You don't be sure. But when someone just says something along the lines of, I believe this is wrong, you, being the kind-hearted and confident Christian that you are, simply respond by saying, okay, why do you think this is wrong? You get the response, well, that's just what I believe. You can then rightly reply, well, so what? What if someone else thinks it's morally right to do the thing you say is morally wrong? Why should I take your position instead of the guy down the street who disagrees? You see, one of the last times, in fact, this might have been the last time we were at Walmart, I had this very brief interaction with this very vulgar and angry woman driving her car out of the parking lot. She didn't like the fact that we were preaching in the parking lot. She said, there are people out here, there are good people out here at Walmart here trying to get shopping done. They want to hear what you're saying. Insert a few expletives here and there. I forget exactly where she put them. But I said, good people? Yeah, there are good people out here. Man, there's no such thing as a good person. Yes, there is. Like, really? Good? According to who? You? Me? The guy down the street? Slew of expletives and blasphemies, and then she drove off. Oh, didn't want to interact on that level, did you? That's all it took to show all the foolishness of what she was saying. Like, who gets to define what is good is the question, right? She called it good. She had no reason for it. It was entirely arbitrary. A very important part of identifying arbitrariness, ask, so what? Why do you believe this? What justification do you have for it? Well, so what issue? But here's the thing. Anything that is arbitrary has no moral force whatsoever. No moral force whatsoever. None. Zero. If it's just arbitrary, it's just based on what they want to think or say without justifying reason. So what? Arbitrariness gives no reason to believe someone has found the truth. None. Maybe you had indigestion that morning from the unwise double pepperoni pizza at 1 o'clock in the morning right before, and now you think differently about reality or ethics before you ate it. Maybe that happens. People will come at you with a litany of things that they believe. Things they believe are true about the world. Things they believe are right and wrong. And they will assert them very strongly. When someone you know rattles off some claim or belief like that, and you're confused as to how to answer, well, you can certainly come to me or to Kip with those things they say. We will always be ever ready to listen to what it was that people that you came across, what we wanted to help you in every situation, and we will. But I'll tell you right now, the first question that I'm going to ask you is, so why does your friend or coworker or teacher or boss or whoever, why does he believe that? Why does he or she think it's true? So if you haven't asked this person why he or she believes whatever it is, that's how you go back and ask them, because they don't get anywhere we don't know. I've already done this. He doesn't know why. In other words, this person has no argument. Someone gets mad about what they believe, or they get louder when you will not accept what they say. People do this. It does not mean that what they have to say is true. The level of volume or the level of emotion is entirely irrelevant to the truth of the matter. Entirely irrelevant. Sorry, modern generation, you're just wrong. Also, just because someone has a bunch of letters after his name and insists you call him doctor doesn't mean that he's any more credible in anything he says if he is being arbitrary. Do not be bamboozled by a litany of credentials or a fancy vocabulary that someone has. They're using a bunch of big words. If all he says or she says is, this is my position, you can simply and politely say, well, all right, I understand that's your position, but big deal. So what? Why should I believe you? You must get to the place where you will almost automatically think and then say, well, that's nice, but why do you believe that? Do you have any logical reason to think that? But a real world example. You probably heard something like this before. Say you hear someone say either in person or on TV or in some weird YouTube video, all human behavior is determined by social conditioning. People are entirely products of their environment. We've all heard someone say this before. It's in the air. People think it. People say it. It's very common. So what should your response be? Exactly. Why do you believe that? Why? How do you know that? Those are the big questions. Let's say you have an old friend that you're talking to over coffee or something. And he or she says, in response to your question, yeah, I believe that everybody's just conditioned by their environment. Like, okay, well, why do you believe that? Well, I remember hearing it from a college professor when I was in college. Okay.
Psychology class.
Sure, in a psychology class. Why not? So what do you say then? Before you answer that, what is that response really? When someone says that, what is that response? Well, it's kind of a deflection, but what is it an appeal to? Authority. It's kind of a version of the pot calling the kettle black, isn't it? The person you're talking to has just admitted to doing what unbelievers, especially atheists, accuse Christians of doing, believing something on blind faith. Just because you read it in the Bible, you believe it to be true, they challenge us. So our response to our friend can be simply, so you believe it just because your professor told you? You're going to need to do better than that. Now your friend's probably going to get uncomfortable, especially if you told him that he or she's doing the same thing that he accuses Christians of doing. So now we're going to hear, okay, well, I believe it because I've seen it. Okay? So what was the premise under analysis here again? That all human behavior is governed by antecedent social forces. All human behavior. So the next question then should be what? So you've seen all human behavior? Wait a minute. No, you haven't. You haven't seen all human behavior. You've not seen all social forces. You don't comprehend all of the causal connections between the two for everyone in the entire world. So you hear well, of course I haven't seen all of them. So in other words, what your friend is doing is he has taken a few human interactions and he thinks he can make a sketchy rundown on how social forces impact human actions. Your friend has a logical problem. He's gone from a very small set of evidence to a very broad conclusion. The evidence he or even his professor or even a whole school of professors has is insufficient to show that every one of the over 8 billion people on the planet has social forces governing all of their behavior in every sense. In other words, they're claiming it, but they don't have justifying reason for it. That's arbitrary. You must not allow the unbeliever to get away with this stuff. That is being arbitrary. When you hear, this is how we know, this is the nature of reality, this is how we ought to live our lives, we need to respond, how do you know that? Why do you believe that? Now, little children tend to get carried away with this, right? They tend to get in trouble with their parents and you tell them to do something. Why is the response you get? Well, that's going to cause problems. It can get annoying or tiresome, obviously. So be thoughtful in how you do social interaction with this, of course, but that is the essence of what you're doing. You are asking, why do you believe that? Is that so? How do you know that? By what standard do you judge what you just said? And you keep asking this sort of question. You continue to push the matter because no one is allowed to be arbitrary. If you can answer it with so what, then it's arbitrary and it has no warrant for belief. Because all I could do is assert the exact opposite, and it has the same moral force as what the person said in the first place. Simply refuted. So, let's look at some more arbitrary arguments. More arbitrary. Mere opinion. This one's fun. We already kind of talked about it already. Sometimes people offer a mere opinion. This warrants a little more in-depth discussion. So why are we talking about it? Well, it's very common. People will often tell you, well, I believe this. Well, why? Well, it's just what I think. Really? That's all? People say this all the time. There are very powerful arguments against unbelief. We're going to go over them. We've already started to. But inevitably, regardless of how badly you just wrecked an unbelieving worldview, someone out there is going to say, well, sure, but my opinion is. Okay. So that you can refute what he says. Maybe explain to a fellow believer wanting more information of how to refute. You do that, but this person that you're talking to says, well, they persist in it. Yes, but it's my opinion. Yes, but it's been refuted. You tell them that, they still persist. Well, that's fine for you, but I have my opinion, and that's fine for me. On the street, this is really common. Yeah, you believe that, but I don't. Okay. What ought to be obvious to anyone making such a foolish objection is not obvious, because it ends up being so awkward, it warrants a little bit more time in our class. Like, you've been refuted and you still persist. Awkward. Definitely. The key intellectual sin. I said there were two. Arbitrary takes more precedence over inconsistent. This is a key intellectual sin. It used to be that part of the reason why people went to school, whatever school it was, so that they could learn to think and reason and make informed judgments about things rather than just fly off the handle with baseless opinions. It used to be. Now they teach them how to campaign for the latest fad and make a bunch of noise and spend money for education and nothing. Anyway, people are supposed to learn principles by which to reason and by which to draw meaningful conclusions without simply spouting off, this is just what I think. It's like the professor in the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, right? Logic. Teach logic in schools. I freely admit, my own education here was really lacking, almost entirely. There was never a class I took throughout grade school, junior high school, college, or even seminary that was specifically about logic. I don't even think one was offered. And that was bad. I've had to play a lot of catch-up since then. Granted, that was half a lifetime ago now. I'd like to think I've learned a little bit of something. But I did have an introduction to philosophy course in college, but it was one semester, and that was it. And it was not specifically about logic or the proper use of it. People today simply do not know how to think properly. They just don't. You see, when an unbeliever says that he only has his opinion, we should jump on that. He's conceded the case. The argument is over. He's lost. That's game. If we were in a public situation, we should be of the mind to say something like, okay, well, here's a microphone. Speak up to all the people here and tell them that all you have is your opinion, which has already been sliced and diced. It's gone. But it's just what you think. It's my opinion. So what? Jeff Durbin has a t-shirt that he wears into street evangelism situations at times. It just has a couple of hands out there like this. So what? Printed on in the middle of it. Maybe I should get one of those. Anyway, so what? And again, we're not trying to be rude to people, but that's what it amounts to. That's your opinion. Your opinion doesn't matter. Truth matters.
They say it's my truth.
Well, we're actually going to get to that. That's a common statement too. In fact, I'll like another page in there. Yeah, that is coming up very, very soon. Your opinion does not determine truth. And if it has been demonstrated that your opinion is false, it's the epitome of foolishness and arrogance to maintain your position. Now, why do people insist on being arbitrary like this? Maybe a better question. Why do Christians put up with it? Why do we put up with it? It's just so nonsensical. Well, first answer, sin, right? People in their sin, we're going to latch on to rescuing devices like we talked about before and try to maintain their foolish beliefs in order to plug their ears against God's truth. It gets increasingly absurd and increasingly arbitrary. But I ask that question, why do we put up with mere opinion? Why do Christians put up with mere opinion? Bonson is of the mind, or was of the mind, he's been gone now for about 30 years, was of the opinion, and I agree, that a large part of the reason for this is that churches have conditioned us to think this way in our own Bible studies. What do you think? Sometimes churches have conditioned us to accept arbitrariness as valid in Bible studies. Think of it this way. You have a leader of a Bible study or a Sunday school class at a church, and he asks people, he or she asks people, right, some of these particular churches, what people think a text means, and somebody responds, well, I think it means this, or it means this to me. Ever hear that before? Oh, that's bad. Very bad. No, barf, especially the second one. Especially if the class leader or the teacher, he's betraying his responsibility. He's validating any and every interpretation offered. Just because he thinks people are entitled to their interpretation of a passage. You are not entitled to your interpretation of the passage. What God has said is what God has said. There's one right way to understand it. We need to conform to that. This is horribly wrong. But that's part of the reason why we have this problem with arbitrariness and why Christians put up with it. Because we've been conditioned to put up with it.
So I asked that in the Bible study one time, and people were giving their ideas and whatnot. And I said, well, I have to tell you that nobody here answered that question properly. And they kind of looked at me like, what? I said, well, you answered the question, what does this mean to you? The only reasonable answer to that question is, it really doesn't matter what it means to you.
That's right.
What matters is what it means.
Exactly. That's exactly right. We all get that, right? How important that is, and how common it is to be saying, well, this is just how I feel about it, or this is how I want to think about God, or this is what it means to me, or I have my opinion and understanding, and I'm going to impose that on the Almighty.
Not everybody else. It's my opinion that the fetus isn't a child until 20 weeks. So you're going to kill all the fetuses that are less than 20 weeks.
And you ask the question, see, this comes up, that's an arbitrary statement. Why do you believe that? Well, it's just what I believe. Life and death is on the line with such a stupid idea. This is why this is so important. How about this? I want to think about God this way. Newsflash, God doesn't care. Yeah, no kidding. God does not care if you have your own little opinion about him. He does not care. What he said about himself, that is what we must believe. And if we do not, then we are wrong. End of discussion. We are bound to what the Word of God says. We are not permitted to think differently. And I'm not permitted to teach differently. I stand here as a servant of the text. I am not Lord over it in any sense at all. And if I ever get the idea that I am, can we? Please. And do it quick. Our opinions do not matter here. The truth matters. The only place your opinion matters is when you're choosing pizza toppings or ice cream flavors. And then you're going to have a fight over it, probably. It's your... What?
Which church to attend?
Well, yeah, I get a church that's going to encourage you, and you're, well, this is how I feel about God, and you get your bingo school.
Seriously, I mean, that's where a lot of arbitrary things come into
Yes,
play.
exactly.
I've heard people say, well, I'm just not being fed at this church.
Oh, yeah.
Fed what? Line a bull?
I know.
Exactly. Why do you want to be fed?
And that's another question. I'm not being fed. Well, why do you think you're not being fed? Ask that question. What constitutes being fed?
So what?
Yes.
So what?
Yes. So what? What do you mean, so what? Well, why do you think you're not being fed?
Babies need to be fed.
Exactly. Take it, digest it, learn it, ask questions. We're not going to pry your mouth open and put the food in it. We'll set it up for you, but part of it is to equip the people for the work of the ministry. That's why we're having classes like this. Anyway, can you tell us a bit of a pet peeve of mine? Now, our opinions do not matter. We talked about pizza, toppings, ice cream flavors. I don't want a pizza or ice cream right now, though. We often speak, by the way, of the sovereignty of God at our church. We talk about that a lot. We're subscribed to the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. The Bible teaches that God is absolutely sovereign, that he has everything predestined, even the number of hairs on our head, even how long this class is going to be today, though I'm not sure how long it's going to be today. We speak about this in our sermons. We expound biblical texts that address this truth. Someone's going to come along and say at some point, well, comes. I want to think about God this way. Big deal. We do not get to determine what God is like. If you don't like to think about God in a particular way that the scriptures tell us who he is. Okay, I feel attacked now.
So what?
Give that woman an A! Okay, for all of you at home, every single one of them held up a sign that said slow down. It's so awful. I felt attacked. It's so awful. Kelly, that was fantastic. All of you conspired against me. That was brilliant. Thank you for doing that. Actually. Okay, maybe if I sit down, it'll help. I get excited and I speed up. I am sorry. But in all seriousness, if I am going too fast, do stop me. That was a very funny way of doing it. That means you're listening in Sunday school.
Now I get to know where he's at.
All right. Now, we don't like to think about God in a particular way. There's a little story that I could tell behind that. I remember James White was having a conversation with someone who was apparently had been up to a whole bunch of different churches, wasn't happy with things. He was expounding Romans 9 to her at one point. And after he discussed the text, he's like, oh, goodness, I could never believe in a God like that. His simple response was, yeah, I know. What? You're not going to believe in God and trust him and take him at his word unless he does the mighty work in you first. Believe the text that God has said about himself. If we're going to believe it, it takes the work of the Spirit of God. Once again, apologetics, evangelism, even teaching theology, we are reliant upon the Holy Spirit to persuade and convince people. We present the truth. We shut down anything anything short of being absurd. Well, I'm just not going to do that. I'm just going to maintain this. Okay, you take everything away, and you trust the Spirit of God to do the work to convince, because only He can. But anyway, often enough, though, to our own shame, even when it comes to the clearest, most authoritative word we have from God in the Bible, when we present it to the unbeliever and he rejects it, we are tempted to think that he is entitled to his own opinion. Aren't we? Oh, I mean, that's okay. It's perfectly fine for you to believe what you believe. I have what I believe. No, it's not okay. You can't convince him. I'm like, well, I can't change what your belief is, but no, Jesus came. We can't force someone to believe the truth, but we need to ask ourselves, did God say that the unbeliever is okay with the non-Christian believing and accepting false things about God? Did God say that? No, he didn't. Jesus is king. Maybe look at it this way. Say a doctor runs some tests on you and shows you the results and demonstrates, say, that you have diabetes. Would it be reasonable and sensible when faced with this reality simply to say, I don't want to believe that I have diabetes. I don't care if you've run a dozen tests, that you've practiced medicine for years, and that you're the fifth doctor that told me this. That's your opinion and I have mine. Now who feels attacked?
Yes.
That's your truth.
All right. Now, obviously that's crazy. But we do this with God, who has infinitely more authority, knowledge, and power than any amount of doctors. People out there will tell you stuff like this about God, about the truth of the Bible, things far more important than your physical health. And with eternal ramifications, it is just madness. They might say something along the lines of, well, okay, but if I were God, I would run the universe differently. All right, after picking yourself up off the floor, recovering from the arrogance of such a statement, try politely to respond, okay, well, that's nice, but you're not God. Yahweh is God. Jesus is God. Your opinion on how he does things does not matter.
I think that what they say when they say they run the things differently, they say, yeah, you're not perfect, so
You don't want to
run
do
the
things.
more.
No.
You're absolutely right. You would run things differently.
Yes, that's exactly true. Again, when someone says, this is just my opinion, it carries no intellectual weight, no moral force. Absolutely zero. Opinions aren't even a dime a dozen. They're free because everyone has one and they're not worth anything in determining truth. Not a thing. So, if someone wants to know what is true, they must say more than simply, I believe it. What's the next question? We know the next question. Why do you believe this? How do you know this? How do you know that, say, Cipro kills bacteria? Why do you think Napoleon was insane when he led France's armies into Russia? How? Why? What's your evidence? What's your proof? What's your reason for believing this? Their opinion is arbitrary and therefore entirely irrational. They've stopped thinking, and then they're going to tell you that they believe in science. Wow. The arrogance of it. You see, that is, people say this, and we tend to think, well, they may have a good point. But they don't. It's arbitrary and it's stupid. Arbitrary. Worthless. Relativism. We talked about this a little bit too. See, now we're zeroing in and digging into these kind of subjects. The relativist is a little more thoughtful than someone who is simply giving you mere opinion. Just a little. He will say, well, you're convinced by this. I'm convinced by other things. This is the idea that you mentioned earlier, Linda. This is when someone says, well, that's true for you. It's true for you. And what I think is true for me. Whatever makes you feel good, whatever makes you happy, kind of create your own little reality in this kind of a situation, don't you? Well, does this work? No. First of all, this is important. That's what true for me means. That's all it means. When someone says, this is true for me, all they are saying is, I believe this to be true. So once again, the so what objection comes up. Well, you believe it to be true, right? Yes, so what? Why do you believe it to be true? Why? Eventually, you're going to have somebody say, well, the why question doesn't matter. It's like, with all due respect, the why question is the most important question. And if I may be so bold, the reason why you think it doesn't matter is because you can't answer it. That's why Socrates got killed. But this is much more important. Anyway, let's see. You might get a different response. Happiness. This is what makes me happy. It's not just true for me. This is just what makes me happy, so I do it. This is what I believe. I'm assuming we've all heard this one. I believe this because this is what makes me happy. Okay. Just because something happens to make someone happy, does that automatically make it a good thing? No. Hitler happily murdered millions, didn't he? That was his truth. That was his reality. Did that legitimize it? No. No, it didn't. Further, dangerous illicit drugs, from what I understand, can create quite the feeling of euphoria, making people feel really good when you take them. So should these dangerous drugs be imbibed by everyone, or even anyone for that matter? No. It really is absurd. If everyone is right, then no one is wrong. Under relativism. And the worst criminals of history become acceptable and even laudable because they pursued their own reality, which is the ultimate. You cannot have a Mr. Potato Head form of who God is or of what reality is. You know how that works, right? The Mr. Potato making God or making reality look whatever one wants, stick something here and there, even if it looks all contorted, we're just fine with that. If God is whatever we want, then he's not God. But we are. It's absurd. If you can make your own truth, as I've said before, the truck in the road won't hit you when you walk out into the middle of the street and insist that the truck on the road won't hit you. And then you become a smear on the pavement. Arbitrariness ends up in absurdity. Arbitrariness ends up in absurdity. It's ridiculous. Truth is not person relative. Go back to the doctor's office example from earlier. The doctor and the previous 5 have told you that you're sick. You cannot say, well, that's true for you. Not true for me. It doesn't work. You are not magically cured of the illness because you say that. In fact, you probably ignore treatment and put you in an early grave. The relativist will also say that you cannot know anything for sure, flirting heavily with skepticism. So let's take a quick example from a university situation, shall we? In university settings, teachers tend to like Christians if for no other reason than you actually care about the class material and you tend to work hard. But the same professor who is glad that the Christian is in his class and working hard will tell the Christian that he needs to let go of Sunday school faith. The professor will also say that truth is relative, and that in the university there may even be other universes to explore. The easy refutation for the relativist is this. If he's a relativist and claims that there is no absolute truth, simply ask if that is true. Is it absolutely true that there's no absolute truth? If so, says yes, well then he refutes himself. If not, then you're free to believe that there is absolute truth and he has no objection. educated people ought to know better than to be arbitrary, to be relativists. But sadly, there are not a lot of educated people in our society today. Now, I don't mean there are not a lot of college graduates in our society today. There are. But that's not the same thing as being educated about how to think properly. People even hold postgraduate degrees, but it doesn't mean they're educated. People can get a piece of paper from a college and telling them that they've earned a degree and that they, even after having done so, they do not know how to research. They do not know how to put together one paragraph of a decent argument, and they don't know how to think properly at home. Remember what I told you about my own experience on a single logic class in grade school, junior high school, college, and graduate level even. I didn't have a single one. It wasn't on the curriculum, and it ought to have been. Yes, I've taken a few cents. I've learned a few things. But why do people not think clearly anymore? Well, we'll talk about it a little with this. We become accustomed to being arbitrary, and when there's a conflict of opinions, we run to relativism because it is more comfortable than dealing with the conflict, isn't it? It's the easy way out. We don't have to have the strain on the relationship, at least not up front. In the long term, you will. But in the short run, it's like, oh, it's easier. Don't rock the boat. Be like the commercial over the holidays when these two people are on the couch and getting ready to start a fight. Somebody runs up with a treat or something. Oh, wait, you're starting a fight. Here, give him a sundae. Here, give this guy a cookie. Let's not even just have the disagreements. See, if you're a relativist, then everyone's welcome at the party. Even Jesus is welcome, right? Sure, until he or one of his followers, like us, has the nerve to say that he is the way, truth, and life, to the exclusion of any and all others. But see, as a relativist, everyone can have a good time because I'm okay, you're okay, we can all just get along and not fight about anything. Oh, barf. Yes?
You know, the paradoxical thing about relativism is that it sets itself up as the absolute,
Doesn't it though?
and it says we're all relativists, and you can't be anything other than a relativist because only relativism is real, which is an absolute statement.
It is.
So I mean, it's obvious that it denies itself in the question that you asked. Is it true that there's no absolute truth? Well, that is just exposing the fact that relativism sets itself up as the absolute, and therefore denies relativism.
And making a statement like that does it, but you can also do what we've been talking about already this evening. Only relativism works. Well, how do you know that? Why do you think that? Just try to get them to justify it. It falls apart in a hurry. But people who contradict each other, who are truly contradicting each other, cannot both be right. Both can be wrong, but both cannot be right. It's logically absurd. It's entirely foolish. But that's what being arbitrary does. We said it already. Being arbitrary always results in absurdity. And the truth is, most people we encounter are either going to be relativists or they're just going to assert their mere opinion. Most of the time in our society. And they'll think they're so smart. Such a heavy deception.
It's so sophisticated.
It does. It sounds so sophisticated. No, it sounds sophistry is what it is, but that's another issue.
Yeah.
So get used to saying this in some way, shape, or form. Used to saying politely that if someone only has their opinion, then it is academically and intellectually worthless. It's only your opinion that God doesn't exist. You're in serious trouble. Now, also, true for you, as we've said, is the mantra of the relativist. He's just claiming that he believes one thing and does not believe another. That's what it is. It's true for me means I believe this. That's all it means. So you can simply say as before, so what? Another useful thing to say in response to these two positions is ask if the person has ever been wrong about anything before. Ever? Well, yes. Oh, really? How do you know that you're being right in your belief now? You already admitted that you haven't been perfect. So how can the truth be relative if you've been wrong about something before?
Exactly, because in relativism implies infallibility. If a thing is true or false relative to what you think, then you can never be wrong.
Exactly.
Never. So if you've been wrong, then you just admitted that you're not actually a relativist.
Mm-hmm. Which is both arbitrary and inconsistent. So we've discussed mere opinion. We've discussed relativism. What's next? Pizza and ice cream. No. Next is ignorance or prejudicial conjecture. A great way to be arbitrary is to be ignorant of what you're talking about. Not know what you're saying. Proverbs 18:13. He gives an answer before he hears. It is his folly and shame. Know what you're talking about before you open your mouth. But sometimes you're going to find unbelievers who will take the offensive against Christianity, and they will not know what they're talking about. They'll be ignorant of the facts. Remember how often I said this probably was in Bonson's own experience, and he was 3 years ago, although knowledge is probably even less today, unless they're just repeating something they read on an atheist website, which is usually not accurate. Probably over 90% of the time, people are going to be ignorant of the Christian position. This kind of arbitrariness is not exclusive of mere opinion or relativism. It tends to tag along behind them. So you'll get to a 2-for-1 deal with arbitrary, doubly dumb. But in the place of reasoning and honest assessment, you are going to get personal conjecture about what seems likely to the person you're talking to. Well, I think it seems like this would be the case. This is kind of what I think, and that makes sense to me. Okay, great. So it happens all the time. People will spout off about what they don't know. They have no idea what they're talking about, but assert things as if they did. Social media is largely a black hole for all this. Don't be a part of the black hole. Be the person trying to pull someone out of it. But don't join them in their ignorant, prejudicial conjecture. Know what you're talking about or don't engage. You ask what the foundation is for what they believe concerning Christianity. They got nothing. I am not sure I've ever been in a conversation with an unbeliever where he or she did not at some point assign a belief to me or a teaching that he claimed was in the Bible that simply was not. Oh yes, that's really common. It's like, chapter and verse, please. It's right, it's not there. They haven't read a book. They haven't done research. Nothing of the sort, short of grabbing a few talking points from the aforementioned atheistic websites. For example, they say something like, we can't trust the Bible. We have. Why? Well, the Bible was written hundreds of years ago, so it's going to seem to the unbeliever that we can't trust the Bible in our hands today. Surely scribes would have altered it, right? How can we know that we have what was from Moses or John or Paul or Isaiah? Could it just be some mark of the Dark Ages who made all these corrections? People say stuff like that. They say it a lot. Usually we angrily say it. I've heard it a lot. But that's ignorant criticism. Ignorant. It passes for intellectual rigor sometimes, but don't be fooled by it. Now, in our normal experience, messages that pass from one person to another do tend to get garbled and confused, don't they? Sure they do. By passing something around the room without someone going along with you and telling you what it is, eventually it's going to be garbled by the time it gets to the other end of the room. It's what happens. But this doesn't happen with the Bible. Why not? Because, again, in the biblical Christian worldview, and in fact, the reality of the situation, the Bible's not just in like any other book or message. It's the Word of God. He has worked to preserve His Word so that we would have an accurate copy of it and be able to stand on it as the source of truth. We must not tire of pointing out the unbeliever is relying on conjecture rather than factual information. Comment earlier that I was set up probably from you held the slow signs. Anyway, the history of textual criticism, which is an important field. The Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, csntm.org, Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. Very important. We have a massive document library that testifies to the belief of the Christian that God guided the process of preserving His Word, something the unbeliever at this point isn't even considering. And if our Christian worldview is right, then we don't need to worry about the preservation of the Bible because it's a given and the data does bear it out. The likelihood the unbeliever posits is just an evaluation based on prejudice or ignorance. We can't really trust about really how much do you know about textual criticism? About how many copies of manuscripts we have, about how old they are, about the library at Qumran we found, and the Isaiah scroll, and the Leviticus scroll, and the Jeremiah scroll. All of which predate Christ by a couple hundred years. Do you know about that? Oh, so you're just ignorantly claiming that we can't trust the Bible. That's what happens. And that kind of claim is arbitrary. You ask for reasons to justify why they would say that. Opinions are not evidence. Just opinions. This is one of my favorite things. It was simply respond with the contrary arbitrary claim. Well, I don't think the Bible's reliable. Well, I do think the Bible's reliable then. Which one is right? People want to play the arbitrary game, then we can just claim whatever we want to make up our own reality. We'll either object to it or see that their own claim doesn't have any merit either. If they object, you can say that you object to their original claim for the same reason. The arbitrary claim doesn't work. Justify your claim. If they cannot justify the claim, then it is mere ignorant, prejudicial conjecture. Related to that is ignoring evidence that's available. Ignoring evidence that's available. We've talked on this a bit too. When it comes to people objecting to the evidence of the Bible text, they're just not aware of it, or they don't take it into account. You see people that know a thing or two about textual criticism and textual variation about the Bible, even unbelievers, people like Bart Ehrman, they tend not to claim that we don't have the actual text because they know better. Yeah, we have it, we're just sorting it out. They might not believe it, but they're not going to object to the textual criticism. Textual criticism has to do with comparing the transmission and history of the document that you read. Biblical textual criticism, we could also talk about other things like Plato's writings, which is kind of funny. Plato, remember Plato? We talked about him a little bit in our class. Very popular idealist philosopher. Again, probably the best one in the history of the world. But our earliest full existing manuscript of Plato's treatises goes back to 900 AD. It was a big find. It was important. Everybody loved to have that. But when did Plato live and thus write and talk? When was he around? And remember? 350 BC, yes! 1985. 1984. So 350 BC, that's a difference of over 1,200 years from the time when Plato was teaching and the earliest set of his writings we have there. We have no manuscripts from Plato until 900 AD. By contrast, what is the gap between the earliest fragments of the New Testament to the time when they were written? About 50 years. 50. We have fragments that date back to about 120 AD out of the Gospel of John. That's amazing. It's really impressive. The bulk of it is about 200 to 300 years. It is remarkably uniform. It is proven over and over. And as I mentioned earlier, the Old Testament's reliability was proven even more so with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, most notably the Isaiah Scroll, which was, in my opinion, the greatest textual discovery in the history of the world. It happened, I think, in the 1950s is when that was unveiled. It was amazing. The whole thing on a scroll, dating back to, I think, 100 to 200 BC. A guy by the name of Mr. Frederick George Kenyon, British paleographer, those are people that study old writing, paleographer. Biblical classical scholar, administrator known for his significant contributions to the study of ancient manuscripts and his roles in major cultural institutions, once said, quote, "The Christian can take the whole Bible in his hand and say without fear or hesitation that he holds in it the true word of God, handed down without essential loss from generation to generation of the centuries." Of course, he's right. It's also interesting, don't you think, that people generally don't question what Plato wrote. This is Plato stuff. This is what we have. We know this. You know, in 1,200 years, he got a lot of time to mess with documents. But people want to object to the New Testament's reliability. The critic is living by a double standard. Some even say we have no evidence that Jesus ever lived. That's funny. No evidence that Jesus existed. People say this. Never mind the Bible has all sorts of information about it. Tacitus, who mentions Christus, someone who died at the hands of Pilate. Pliny the Younger, Josephus refers to James, Jesus' brother, called Christ. You see, by the way, refusing to take the Bible as a valid source is also ignorant prejudice. They just don't want to take it into account. We can't use the Bible. Remember that little video I played with Richard Dawkins? You can't go to the Bible. And why not? Because you're prejudiced against it, that's all. The issue of the Hittites. We know who the Hittites were, right? People, Old Testament talks about them. Who's the most famous Hittite in the Bible? Remember? Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was a Philistine. Uriah the Hittite was one of David's mighty men. He was a soldier in his army, and David had him murdered because of his wife. Terrible story. Horrible thing that happened. But the Hittites. The Bible was mocked for the depiction of the Hittites for a long time. Ridiculed about it until in 1860 1871, we discovered the Hittite civilization. And now it's one of the best known cultures of the ancient world. Archaeology has consistently demonstrated itself to be an enemy of biblical critics. Consistently. Of course, we should expect that. Why? Because the Bible really is true and it's God's word and we live in his world. We must expose the conjecture and the prejudice of unbelievers and use it to embarrass them when they use arbitrary and ignorant conjecture instead of using evidence and reasoning. They just ignore the evidence that's available. Now, evidence alone will not convince people to be Christians. We know this. But it can help them, it can rather keep them from dismissing the Bible out of hand by clearing up their ignorance sometimes. Sometimes they just run to increasingly absurd rescuing devices. They don't like to be shown to be silly, but it's silly. Another way of being arbitrary. Unargued philosophical baggage or unargued philosophical bias. What is unargued philosophical bias? Presuppositions, assumptions that were brought into an argument that don't have any evidence or support. So we need to expose what the critic takes for granted. Often, the unbeliever is going to read something like floating axe heads in the Bible, talking donkeys. How many animals can fit in the ark? I talked about a guy I was interacting with last week about that thing. The resurrection, healing the blind, and they're just going to say that can't happen. Nope, impossible, can't happen. Floating axe heads, are you serious? We are serious. Of course, the Christian world, that's not a problem. Not to do it once. But they'll attack you on that basis. That just can't happen. So what does that amount to? Well, they just don't believe the written reports in the Bible. That's all it is. Well, they don't believe it. We're trying to win them to Christ. They don't believe it. If they did, we wouldn't be having this discussion. They'll say things like, we know people can't walk on water. That's been fabricated then. We're familiar with this line of reasoning. We engage in it at times. Of course we do. You go to the supermarket. Let's talk about Kroger again because I like to talk about Kroger. We look at one of the tabloids and we see the article titled, Woman Gives Birth to Her Own Father. Alien comes down and marries Beyonce. Well, that might be. Okay.
Second one more believable.
Second one, yes, maybe so. But what does your reasoning process look like when you see something like that in the checkout line? You're like, that's just ridiculous. That's absurd. It couldn't have happened, right? Unbelievers are going to say similar things about the Bible. They'll say, we use computers and smartphones today. We can't be concerned with such silly stories. And that's how they'll describe it. But they really need to stop and recognize what the controlling premise is here. Their presuppositions, their unargued bias that is causing them to reject the Bible's account of miracles outright. They're going to say that they know that miracles can't happen. They know it. Wait a minute, no? Really? How do you know this?
No one has ever had happen to them.
Never happened to them? Oh, okay.
Totally.
And you've seen everything in the entire universe. We can go back to that discussion too. You know how all 8 billion people, every situation that's ever happened on Earth? They say that miracles run counter to ordinary experience and they're not predictable. Well, duh, that's why we call them miracles. Wow, good definition. Of course, you've just given it to me. Thank you. They're not normal. If they were, we wouldn't call them miracles. This is begging the question once again. Something we'll deal with in more detail later. They really do not know that there's no such thing as miracle. They claim they know it, but they really don't. Ask the believer how he knows that miracles don't exist. How does he know? What would it take for them to know that miracles don't exist? Really, it's going to take one of two things. One of two things. What are those two things? What do you think they are? For him really to know that miracles don't exist, what would they be? Either he's going to have to be omniscient and know everything so they can eliminate any possibility of there being miracles, or God told him that there's no such a thing as a miracle. Of course, number one, he's not omniscient. Secondly, if God told you, well, the miracle's not a problem. Game, set, match. Sorry, that doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. Again, God can do what he wants. People will not argue the existence of miracles. They will simply reject them. They won't argue them. They will insist on this law-like function of nature because they've experienced, once again, a small part of it. That is called a hasty generalization fallacy. We'll talk more about that later when we cover logic under the preconditions of intelligibility. So let's have a little fun. Some reversals. Like I said earlier, one of the best ways to respond with an arbitrary statement is with a reversal. Common ones that you think, well, I don't believe that miracles are possible. Reverse it. Well, I do believe that miracles are possible. Well, that can't be true. Why? Yeah, absolutely, it must be true. They're not going to know what to do with you. Because they think they're so smart in asserting this, and you're like, no, it's absolutely wrong what you're saying. I believe the opposite. Well, why? Exactly why? Let's talk about that. Assert the opposite. Don't let them get the upper ground. That'll throw them off. Most people, I don't think, push back that way. It's fun to do on social media, too, sometimes. People typically don't respond though. So, just think about that. Someone angrily asserts something contrary to the biblical testimony. Kindly and politely assert the opposite. See what happens. Well, I don't believe in your God. Well, I absolutely do believe in God. He's the only thing that makes things make sense. Huh? How can you think that? I would love to tell you. Arbitrariness doesn't work. And it can be shut down by arbitrariness. Because eventually you have to have reasons for what you believe. Oh, look at reversals. We did that. A.I.C.P. We continue. We did arbitrary. Let's do inconsistent. I is for inconsistent. I feel like a picture book with Sesame Street characters. We should have that. No, we shouldn't. All right. No one is allowed to be inconsistent either. Never. No, no, no. You cannot be inconsistent. Notice I did not say you may not be inconsistent. I said you cannot be inconsistent. It simply doesn't work. What does it mean to be inconsistent? If someone is being inconsistent, it means that they have a position or a belief in their worldview that is not compatible with another one of their positions or beliefs. That is, the person you're talking to, he or she has contradictory beliefs. There's the good word. And that word will be more important again once we cover logic to some degree. Contradictory beliefs. No one is allowed to contradict himself or herself when doing any kind of philosophy or reasoning or theology or doing theological reasoning about philosophy or whatever. Can't do it. Why? Well, there are many reasons why you can't have contradictory beliefs. But here's the big reason. If you're inconsistent, you can prove anything. Anything. You can prove anything from contradictory premises, which is another way to say you're being inconsistent. And when you say you can prove anything from contradictory premises and you're just being contradictory, you're back to being arbitrary. And, well, we've already talked about that. Let's do this. My first premise. P. My second premise. Not P, where P simply means premise. D means premise. P for premise. Everyone know what a premise is? You know what a premise is? Okay, that's good. Anyway, the premise, just in case you may not, a premise is a statement in an argument. It's a proposition. It's something that you're claiming to be true. That's your premise. Most of the time, people are not going to be so straightforward as to put it this way. P and not P. I'm saying premise, I'm saying also not the other one. I'm affirming both. Most of the time, they're not going to do that. They're not going to come out and say something along the lines of, my car is brand new, and also my car is 20 years old. They won't do that. It's not going to be that easy typically. Obviously, such a statement is inconsistent. It is a contradiction. It won't be so obvious. Inconsistency in an unbeliever's position might be buried in dozens or even hundreds of statements or premises in a person's worldview. But as you go through them, you're going to find that every unbelieving worldview, there will be something that will be inconsistent and contradictory. Every unbelieving worldview is going to fall apart. I really mean that. It will. Let's take a couple contradictory statements. It's P, not P. P and not P. We'll get to the law of non-contradiction. That's kind of important. We'll do that on the screen. P and not P. My ball is entirely red. It is also true that my ball is not entirely red. Can those two things coincide if you mean the same thing by red and entirely and ball? No. Not at the same time they can't. Now, 5 minutes difference, it could be that way because my ball could be entirely red now. 5 minutes later, I might paint it entirely yellow. Is that a contradiction? No, because they have to be the same thing in the same respect at the same time. Something can change. But that is what the law of contradiction is. That can't happen. You cannot have an entirely red ball and a ball that is not entirely red in the same way, in the same respect, at the same time. To affirm it is nonsense. It simply cannot be the case. This world does not comport with contradiction. One of the foundational laws of logic is the law of non-contradiction. There are three. There's that one. It's very important. This will help you reason, think, and write. Understanding things like this. We'll get into logic, as I said, more fully when we hit preconditions of intelligibility. But for now, simply say that any inconsistency will show a contradiction, It violates the law of non-contradiction, and if it is contradictory, it cannot be true. Cannot, impossible, no way, no. And it will also very likely show some form of arbitrariness. So what are some kinds of inconsistency? What are some kinds of that? Presuppositions that do not comport with each other. They don't go together. We are looking for, what do you think we're looking for? We're looking for these. Once again, the three core areas of philosophy, at least ethics. Kip likes to say axiology, which is probably better, but we're talking about ethics because we're talking about how people live, and it's very helpful in this particular set. It's this particular field of apologetics, I should say. We're looking for metaphysical commitments, epistemological procedures, and ethical values. What do they believe about reality? How do they know what they know? Why do they think they should live a certain way? Not everyone thinks clearly about these things. Everyone doesn't think clearly about these things. But everyone does have assumptions about how we know what we know, the nature of reality, and how we live our lives. You need to listen carefully as the unbeliever talks and explains what he thinks and why. Listen carefully. Repeat back what he said. You said such and such. Yes, that's what I said. That's what you believe. Yes, that's what I believe. Okay, now that I know I'm representing you correctly, that doesn't work. Eventually, he will be inconsistent. And you give him the rope by which he hangs himself. It will happen. Ask questions. Ask about the nature of reality. Think about, let's see, last lecture. What's the nature of reality? Is it one kind of thing? Is it two kinds of thing? Infinite bits, mind and matter, or only matter? Do you have freedom or don't you? How do you know those things? Are your senses reliable? Is your memory reliable? Do you have some sort of a revelation as a basis for what you think? What's the source of human knowledge? What's human nature like? What is right and wrong in relationships? What is man's ultimate purpose? Questions like this. Be a good detective. The unbeliever almost certainly will not come right out and say, well, my presupposition is this. And he certainly will not say, I'm inconsistent here and this is why I'm wrong. You're not going to get that. Ask questions and uncover it. The truth is they may not be able to say what their philosophical presumptions are without some prompting because they haven't thought deeply about it. They're not taught to think about this sort of thing these days. But if you keep pressing those questions, you will always eventually find that the unbeliever's presuppositions will be inconsistent. They will not comport. There will be a contradiction. They're taking something for granted, and when that happens, it falls apart. So, let's talk about his ethical position, which is inconsistent. Yes, question?
I was still right. Good back.
I think so. Yes, there we go. I'm happy to go back. While you're writing, I'll get another drink from my mom. Because I talk too fast. That's I love it. That was hilarious. Even Helene was laughing about it back then. Oh my. Okay, I'm clicking now. We're good? Yep. Clicking. Ethical position. An inconsistent ethical position. What is ethics? Ethics is how we ought to live our lives. The unbeliever will be inconsistent ethically. He will have contradictory positions, morally and ethically. So let's say you have an unbelieving neighbor. Most of us do. This one says that you only go around once in life, so party it up. Go for all the gusto you can get. If you're a hedonist neighbor, living for all the pleasure in life. Now, he's not going to say that he's a hedonist. And in this case, someone who is a quantitative hedonist to get it all that you can rather than a qualitative hedonist like Epicurus who didn't want to get social diseases, so he was sitting around with his friends and eating something nice and getting a nice drink together was kind of his idea of pleasure. But if you tell him that he's a hedonist, you're probably going to get a cross-eyed look and they'll probably tell you to pass the beer or something. He's like, well, I'd give you a beer. Anyway, the assumption is that pleasure is the leading value in his life and that there's no accountability after this life. You only go around once, live it up. But now the same guy expresses extreme indignation over well-documented examples of police brutality or over pedophiles convicted in court with a mountain of evidence demonstrating it. He hates it when weaker nations get invaded by powerful tyrants. He's got a Ukraine flag in his Facebook bio. He's angered by light sentences handed down to rapists and even believes that they ought to receive the death penalty, which they should. You see the picture I'm painting for you here? Pick any of those examples. Maybe the one from earlier about Joe and his thoughts about sodomy and Putin. We know people like this. We probably have neighbors like this. We have coworkers like this. Such a person believing that life is all about pleasure, grabbing all of it that you can, which is the worst form of hedonism, that is, desiring pleasure and seeking it. But they condemn one or all of the other things that I listed. This is a huge inconsistency. Huge. Contradictory. These two views, pleasure being the highest value and brutality must be condemned, reveal the tension in his thinking. Do you see how? Do you see the inconsistency? What is it? What's the inconsistency here? I might start humming the Jeopardy theme. Where's that whistle?
He thinks it's okay for him to do whatever he wants to do, in his opinion, what is pleasurable. But then he's making judgments about other people who are doing things which to them may qualify as pleasure. That's what they want to do. So why is it okay for him to do what he wants to do, but these other people not to do what they want to do?
Exactly. And you ask that kind of question, what you've done, he's already hung himself. You didn't really have to do anything other than ask a question. Kelly's exactly right. If the police get enjoyment and pleasure out of beating people's senses with nightsticks, and if someone is supposed to grab all the gusto you can get in this life, then on what basis do you condemn the police officer? He's just living by your standard, but yet you condemn him. Inconsistent, contradiction, game over. Doesn't work. You've discovered that your neighbor's presuppositions do not comport with one another. He is not consistent, and thus he is contradictory, meaning his overall position cannot be true. Make sense? Can't work. Let's talk about inconsistencies. That's in ethics. Let's talk about inconsistencies in the realm of epistemology. His theory of knowledge. How does he know what he knows? Okay. Another critic of the faith will say that you should not believe what you do believe, because you haven't seen it. Better yet, you haven't even perceived it. Seeing is believing, he says. You, the Christian, believe things you haven't seen, so you're gullible and superstitious. We believe things about God because the Bible, after all. Now, how do you address this inconsistency in your friend? Well, you're going to show it to be inconsistency by asking a question. Recurring theme, right? By the way, friend, how did you come to know that all knowledge is limited by what we can see or hear or touch? How do you know this? How did you come to understand this? Well, he explains that he's been reading a book he checked out from the local library. And in that book, he read that you can only know for sure what you observe with your senses. Pounce on that. It's like, okay, friend, you mean to tell me that you believe this because you read it in a book? Or heard it from a professor? Or saw it in a documentary? You're taking it on authority from something, aren't you? See what I'm doing? First of all, how is that consistent with sensory observation? It's not like he touched or saw the principle itself. It's a concept, right? He didn't lay hands on that. He can't put ketchup on it and eat it for dinner. The concept, not the book, Tony. But secondly, that's the same thing he's criticizing you for doing. It's contradictory in two ways, then, isn't it? Furthermore, no one's observed literally everything that we talked about before. He's refuted himself. You believe it because God says so, yeah, and you believe it because you read it in a book at the library. Who has more authority, the author of the book or God? Oops. Contradiction. Falls apart. Self-refutation is the most brutal form of refutation. But see, most unbelievers will have no idea they're contradicting themselves when they say things like this. It will miss them completely because people don't know how to think these days. And their sinful ways are causing them to suppress the knowledge of God. So look for it. And when they do this and they contradict themselves, pin them to the wall. Kindly inject. Pin it to the wall. Logical fallacies. Look for these. Logic, of course, is a subset of epistemology. These are ways people have inconsistencies in their worldview. Take a course on logic. It's a good idea. It's strongly recommended. Canon Plus is a video series on logic. It is excellent. Doug Wilson and Jason Lyle have both written good and accessible books on logic. We'll get into specific logical fallacies. Once again, we're talking about logic under preconditions of intelligibility. We're going to spend a lot of time on this because there's a whole bunch of it. But logical fallacies, take an introductory course on logic. The first one on Canon Plus, if you happen to have that, it's like a 35, 36 video series. They're short. Some videos are only 10 minutes long or something. But it will help you think more clearly. It will help you identify bad reasoning, contradictory things that simply will fall apart. Talk about ethical inconsistencies, some logical inconsistencies. Of course, you know what we're going to talk about next. Metaphysical inconsistencies. The unbeliever will have metaphysical tensions and inconsistencies in his understanding of reality. So, say the college professor. You happen to know a college professor who thinks that human free will is entirely an illusion. Our will is an illusion. He teaches that everything we do is because we're conditioned to do so by our environment. We talked about somebody like this before, right? Now, let's say professor. Let's say he has a student come final exam time. He's taking his final exam test, and the student straight up cheats on the test. If he fails the student, he's violating his own principle. Because the student couldn't help cheating. And since he couldn't help cheating, he's not responsible for his actions. Oops. You know what? He's going to fail that student. He's not going to live consistently with his claims. Self-refutation. Worst, most painful form of refutation. By the way, the professor wouldn't even have the freedom of whether or not to punish the student. That would have been condition too, wouldn't it? See how long that took? I didn't take any time at all to refuse. Like, this is absurd, sir. What do you mean? You're going to fail the student if he cheats, aren't you? Well, yeah, but didn't you just teach him that everything is conditioned and that he can't help it? I need to go. You're going to have tensions between your epistemology and metaphysics. Tension. Lots of tension. Between how they know and how they view reality. You might have someone who's an empiricist. That person, again, is someone who believes that everything that we know is something we can observe with our senses. But he's also going to tell you that it's illogical to believe otherwise. And that didn't happen because that wasn't part of my understanding. This is my umbrella. No. You listen to the Bonson lectures, you know what I keep saying. But in any case, you have an empiricist. He believes that all that you can know, you observe with your senses, but it's illogical to believe that's something else. Well, wait a minute. Are the laws of logic physical? Can we observe the laws of logic with our senses? No. Because, see, the problem is evident, isn't it? What this person is appealing to by saying that all we can do is understand things that we can observe with our senses, but also that we shouldn't be illogical. He's appealing to something that doesn't exist, given his working. Laws are not particulars, they're universals, and they're abstract. All right. Next, behavior that betrays professed belief. Behavior that betrays this professed behavior. I mentioned a little bit of that already. Maybe it's evident that he's a hypocrite. He says one thing, and he does another. Saying one thing and doing another is a form of irrationality, because in this case, there's a belief at work when someone says something and another belief at work when he acts. The life of the unbeliever is riddled with these kinds of contradictions, these kinds of inconsistencies. The atheistic unbeliever is going to attend a funeral to honor a dead friend because he cared about it. And even though he may have argued with you previously over coffee, saying that people are no different from dogs or snails, given the process of evolution. Funny how he's not going to have a funeral for the ant he stepped on during his morning jog this morning. Why not? Isn't the ant ontologically the same as his friend at work who died? We're all from the same stardust. But we're not going to have a funeral for the ant. But you already have a funeral for your friend? You're going to miss him and mourn your friend, but not the anthill that you stepped on or an ant sprayed down? Pouring salt on snails? It's gross. Don't do that. Well, maybe do that. But anyway, the behavior betrays what he said, doesn't it? He affirms by his actions that he really does believe in the dignity of man, but not the dignity of an ant. He will claim that we're no greater than an ant, that we have just biochemical processes working out in our brains, but then he's going to go home and kiss his wife and children and act like there's something called love. He will claim that anything goes sexually, but then will be indignant if his wife, if she sleeps around behind his back. He will claim that things in this universe are random and happen by chance, and then turn around and look for law-like explanations of things, doing mathematics, and expecting it to work consistently every time. End of the day. Those are some inconsistencies. Now, this week's engagements, and we'll do those after we do the next section. I didn't think we were going to be quite this far. We have a little bit more, so we're going to bump that down a little bit. But I'll do my slide later. The A.I.C.P. C is for consequences. A is for arbitrary. I is for inconsistent. C is for consequences. This one's fun. And this is where we get biblical process from Scripture itself to dismantle pretty much anything. We can call people on being arbitrary, we call on being inconsistent, and this is how you set it up, by showing bad consequences for things. Third letter acronym, A.I.C.P, consequences. That is, we show how the unbeliever's worldview has inevitable and undesirable consequences if worked out to its logical conclusions. Inevitable and undesirable consequences if worked out to its logical conclusions. That's what we do with this one. We show the unbeliever that he doesn't want what he's claiming. Jesus said that you were to judge a tree by its fruit. Regardless of what people say about a tree, and claim what kind of tree it is, you know what kind of tree it is when you see its fruit. If it has bananas, it's a banana tree. If it has apples, it's an apple tree. If it has bad ideas, it's an unbelieving worldview. You will see this. It will come out. Judge a tree by its fruit. Multiple places in the Gospels. It's all over the place. We're using this illustration. So, here is an important example of problems in this area, by the way. A terrible inconsistency, really. You see this anytime the lamestream media reports on some nutty person leading a cult that causes the deaths of its adherents or some other terrible thing like rampant sexual abuse or something. There's always a bias here. When you have the media reporting on this, what is always part of the reporting? They report on how religious the person was. Don't they? Their religion was the cause of all these problems. He was a religious nut. You've heard it. I've heard it. How many times have you had the accusation leveled at you by an obstinate unbeliever that religion has caused so many wars in history? I've seen it. I've heard it. You have too.
Just not the bloodiest.
No, not the bloody students. Never mind. Shh. Inconsistent, right? Such is the fruit of strong religious belief, we are told. Right? They can think that's the consequences of belief. How about we flip it around on them? What are some of the consequences of unbelief?
60 million dead babies. 50 years.
That's one of them, isn't it?
What is your reason for living?
What is my reason for living?
No, just if you're not a believer, why do you choose to stay at 5?
That's a fair question.
I know it's a rough one, but
Oh, it's a rough question, yeah, but they're like, wait, what? What's your reason for living? Give me a good reason for it. If you're not going to start it.
Because they might follow through.
Yeah, maybe use that as part of the question and answer part of the discussion. Maybe not launch with that.
Why are we
Maybe.
here?
Why are we here? These are good questions. But how about this? Let's talk about the consequences of unbelief. We can talk about a guy by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the primary thinkers of the Enlightenment. How lecherous and vicious and cruel he was. He was an evil man. He fathered many, many children by different women and never provided for them, though he claimed children ought to be cared for. How about this guy, Bertrand Russell? Known for taking terrible actions, having wicked temperament. We'll talk more about him a little bit later. We can talk about Friedrich Nietzsche and his raging madness. And people respect these men, even though they lived horrible, wicked lives. We can talk about various departments. How about the sociology department? The fruit of unbelief in sociology. We have cultural relativism. Ethics is relative. Ethics is relative? Okay, this amounts to the equivalent of a high school math teacher collecting all of his papers for a homework assignment, finding different answers to some of the problems, and then explaining, lo and behold, math is relative. Okay, brothers and sisters, the king has no clothes, all right? He does not. Because you're going to say, in sociology, that there's no relativism, ethics, well, then we don't have an objection to racist culture that existed in the United States, or we wouldn't have a right to reform it, because that was what was going on at the time. Just ditch Martin Luther King Jr. It would have been wrong to stop the Nazis. It would have been wrong to stop Stalin because that was their reality. That's what they wanted to do. And who are we to impose our will on them? No one wants to argue that way. How about law? The law department. Justice is just the interest of the stronger, others have said. Wait a minute. Why can't you say that? Why not might makes right? Legal theory is often hated by people. I find it interesting. What is the true nature of law and justice, etc.? People will argue about what constitutes people being treated unjustly or unfairly, but where's the foundation? At the end of the day, in unbelief, might makes right, and no one can object to that. That's wrong. Really, why do you say that? He thinks it's right. He's thrown the gun. the fruit of unbelief. We're just getting warmed up. Political science, if you are kind enough to call it science. The unbelieving world, even some Christians will say that we do not want an explicitly Christian legal theory. But then every time an election rolls around, people complain about cheating. And they decry anything that is not fair and free. Oh, you hear it all the time. Well, why? Why would they decry this? Well, they would say it's unfair to impose a legal order on a people that they didn't freely choose, we hear. Who says? Why should people get to choose their rulers? When people say this, they are appealing to a standard beyond themselves. They're even appealing to a standard beyond the society in which they live. With unbelief, there is no such standard. And cheating in elections should be praised if it gets people what they want. It's that might makes right thing again we were talking about. The strong or crafty get what they want at the expense of the weak and not so crafty, and there will be nothing wrong with it. Psychology. We can run the whole university if we want. We really could. We can do most of it. Most people are going to say that there is no spiritual dimension to man anymore, for atheist people. Mind of man is really just his brain. So what is self-consciousness then if we only have a brain and not a mind? Where is human dignity if all we are meat machines? What sense does it make for you to go home and kiss your wife and children? Economics. What's the justification of private property? Why not just have the government take it all as the communists claim? What would be wrong with that? Biology. What is the essence of life? What makes man different and better than a fish? By the way, the fires in Los Angeles are a direct consequence of some of this bad thinking. If you recall, part of the reason why they didn't have water in their fire hydrants is because of a plan to try to protect an endangered fish and not let send the water downstream, so to speak, so that people could get the water they needed to put out some fires. No. The potential problem, the people are more important. How about mathematics? Why are the laws of math applicable to how we live, how we do research, how we construct buildings? Why do we study mathematics? They're all concepts. As a Christian, I can tell you why I study mathematics, but if all you believe is just reality, what you can observe with your senses, your unbelieving position, why study mathematics? How about history? What is history? Is there meaning in history at all? If not, why study it? Why study certain events in history and not others? What makes something relevant? What is the nature of historical causality? Why should we care? If there's no objective meaning in any past event for the unbeliever, studying the subject would be a waste of time. Literature and language. Is there objective meaning in language? How do we know how to read something? Did you know that there are people who claim that there's no correct reading of any historical text? Every reading is a wrong reading, they say. And of course, if they were to write that sentence on a piece of paper, they would expect you to understand it how they intended it.
Well, and not everyone could be, because how would they know what the correct version is?
It completely eliminates knowing anything that's written. That's absurd. Ever hear someone claim, by the way, that the Constitution's a living document? That's the fruit of unbelief. In any and all unbelieving worldviews, what the writer of Ecclesiastes says is true in the most extreme sense. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Vanity. Meaningless. You have every right to ask in any of these categories. In the university, you're talking to a friend of yours or whoever, what the consequences of unbelief are in these areas. You will not like what you get. But we're not done. What culture gets produced by an unbelieving worldview? Art and music. Have you seen modern art? Where's the order? Where's the beauty? Seriously, people tape a banana to a wall and call it art. Oh, that's brilliant. That was really sophisticated there. They model a dog defecating and they call it art. How about music? Compare any modern, unbelieving music like Beyonce or Cardi B to something like Handel's Messiah and the beauty in that. There's no comparison. It's just stupid. That's what unbelief produces in art and music. People claim they have a right just to offend people and produce that which is revolting. Do you know why that is? Why does unbelief lead to these things? As Christians, this really shouldn't surprise us. Art used to be something that highlights beauty, especially of God's creation. God called it good. We wanted to replicate that in how we produced art and music. Handel wanted to magnify Christ and produce, in my opinion, the greatest musical composition of all time. It's masterful, beautiful. But these days, no one can tell where the boundaries are because in the unbelieving worldview, there are no boundaries. That's what unbelief produces. How about this one? Not just politics, but political culture. Does anyone really trust politicians these days? You're silly if you do. No, we don't. How about this one? You know this one. How do you know when a politician is lying? His mouth is moving, right? Pork barrel legislation. U.S. aid. Just trying to get reelected. Who cares about the constituents? Congress exempts itself from its own legislation again and again. We already talked about cheating in elections. And why not in the unbelieving worldview? Why have honesty? Why do good on behalf of your constituents? Why not just look out for number one? It's consistent with the unbelieving worldview. It's not consistent with the Christian worldview. We would have honest politicians that would fight for what's right and stand up for their constituents, even if it costs them money to do so. But that's not what we get. And Christians are the problem?
And Christians will even go against their constituents if what the constituents want
Is against what God has said.
is against God's.
Oh, by the way, we have an ever-growing size of the state, by the way, at least until Elon started kicking people around. But an ever-growing criminal element at the same time. Notice that? Increasing size of the government and increasing crime. Funny, isn't that? I suppose. But isn't one of the primary functions of government to punish the evildoer? But in an unbelieving world where people don't care about right and wrong and actually aren't concerned about that, that's what you get. You get a bloated government and increase in crime. You get fiat money. Rampant inflation, the value of your money determined by the whims of politicians and how much money they want to create out of thin air. Not caring at all who gets hurt the most, the people they're claiming to protect, the aged and the poor. But why not? Why not? In the unbelieving worldview, who cares? That's what unbelief produces. Even minimum wage is an example of this, by the way. Artificially enforcing somebody to pay someone, even if they can't afford to do so. The guy that wants to mop your floor for $5 an hour, the feds say they have to pay him at least $7.25. He doesn't get the job. He doesn't get the work experience. He doesn't get the money. You don't get your floors mopped. Because the property and the money belongs to the shop owner. Eighth commandment. He gets to determine what he wants to pay people, and the person agrees to work for that much. Negotiated contract between the payor and the payee. That's all that should happen. Because of the eighth commandment. Anyway, legalized theft through inflation and taxation. Oh, how about the quality of goods and services? Have you noticed that everything is junk? Shoddy manufacturing, poor quality, rude service, eternal hold times, and incompetent representatives on the phone. And why not? Why actually look out for your customers? Why be honest with them? Why make a good product? In the unbelieving worldview, what's the point? You got their money. You got what you wanted. You're patting your pockets. Why should you care about someone else? That's the fruit of unbelief. How about education? Aside from the fact that public education shouldn't exist, what do we have in it? Unmotivated teachers, terrible academic performance, rampant immorality, transgender madness. How about sexual infidelity, hookup culture, divorce, abortion? We condemn Hitler, but as Kit noted a few minutes ago, in the United States, we made him look like an amateur. We could also insert here the reality that atheistic governments in just the 20th century were responsible for the murders of nearly 100 million people, most of the time citizens of their own countries, and it still continues unchecked in places like North Korea and China today. They're not Christian countries, they're atheistic regimes, and they kill off their own citizens if they good and well feel like it. So, when the news comes on, or your friend has the nerve to lay the blame of the ills of the world or your society on religion, especially Christianity, they have some nerve. Let's have a full disclosure, by the way, not just a free disclosure. see such things happening in the news or in a discussion with a friend over coffee, it's perfectly appropriate to say, well, that's just what unbelief produces after all. Let's see what kind of a reaction. Because that is just what unbelief produces after all. We're going to talk about one of the best ways to demonstrate unwanted consequences through something called the twofold apologetic approach, which we will talk about next week. We will start with a twofold apologetic approach. But I'm going to talk about a couple of things from today's examples and also answer some questions. It seems to be the case. I was wondering if I was going to have my own example this week because I didn't run across anything yesterday. But yeah, this guy decided to respond to something I commented on a post on Wish TV. Wish TV just once Randy all this stuff, they all just fell apart. Let's see. Previous notifications. And there it is. Guy by the name of Brian Myers. All right. Now, Wish TV's post was talking about something that happened in Alabama and several other Republican governor states that are pushing to enact more laws this year legally to define two sexes, and only those, based on observations at birth. If you wanted to go back, you could base the observations on conception if you wanted to. That's what they're doing. Go ahead. That's the Wish TV article they shared. And this one guy comments like, we're a party that likes to boast about freedom. They sure seem obsessed with taking freedom away from a lot of Americans. Go, well, so I commented. No one has the freedom to operate opposed to reality. You cannot live in God's world while trying to violate the most basic realities of the created order, such as male and female, and hope to thrive. What you'll end up doing is destroying yourself. And that's true. You destroy yourself. You go by this transgender madness, you harm people, and they can never. What have you done? Oh, look at that. But what you'll end up doing that will harm themselves, and it's irreversible damage. And lots of people are getting angry about it and laughing, and all your angry reacts and laugh reacts to what I said. I said, getting angry at a sensible statement just makes you look foolish. There is male and female, that's it. Any attempt to change that results in physical and mental destruction. We should expect such destruction too, given how God made the world, telling us in Genesis 1. Facebook is all right, here we go. This guy tells me that I can't make those kinds of statements because that would suggest that we don't have the ability to do things such as give people toupees or to have reconstructive surgery to restore them, because that's also violating reality. I said, no, it's not. If you actually read everything in context, you know, how people are actually made.
How does getting a toupee change your...
See, that's the whole point. He was using different categories. I said, okay, here, listen. And I'm not going to pick and choose, obviously, but you have to take it all into account, I said. The most basic realities are not defined by every one of us. They're defined by God himself. In the above example, to use some of yours, it's natural for people to have hair on their heads. So having a toupee to mimic that which is natural, that is, what God has given, is appropriate. For a woman to have reconstructive surgery or sorts to repair damage to her chest would also be something natural. However, it's entirely unnatural and against God's creative order to cut off healthy body parts, especially in an effort to deny the reality of male and female woven into every single cell in our body. That's the point. God has made us male and female. It's wrong to try to pass ourselves off as something we're not, blur the lines between the two. Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. The image of God he created, the male and female he created. This guy's going to just taking screenshots. These things being disagreeable. complaint was that medical intervention, if we're doing something like that, is also violating the reality of the created order if you're making changes to these kinds of things. No, that's a category error. Medical intervention is a good thing because it preserves life, which is something that the Bible talks about all throughout. By the way, everyone does believe in God, by the way, so just because people find myriads of reasons to suppress that reality doesn't change it. But they do it in order to justify their own abhorrent ideas, such as transgenderism. But let's just say for a moment, for the sake of argument, that God doesn't exist. What do you get then? For all that stuff we just talked about with regard to unbelieving worldview? When you end up with a world with no standard of any kind, you have no moral ought. All it would be is one person's opinion against another. The very concept of truth disappears. Arguments become meaningless. And you see, you don't believe that. You think arguments are important. You have a moral code which is part of your worldview, your philosophy of life. So because only the one true God can account for logic, truth, and morality, he necessarily exists. It's impossible for him not to exist. And you testified to that simply by arguing with me in the first place. You're not thinking about the meaningful categories. I'm saying morality isn't intelligible. As a whole category without the God of the Bible. It's a bold claim. I realize that. However, it's one I'm prepared to pay the bills on. I can demonstrate it here if you're willing to continue. To answer this question, what makes something immoral? You obviously think I'm immoral for supporting a ban on everything transgender. Why? Why am I wrong outside of your arbitrary opinion? Inquiring minds want to know. He simply responded, if you're not willing to recognize there are other belief systems outside of your own, there's no point in debating morality beyond anything what goes on pizza toppings. I said, of course I recognize there are other belief systems. It doesn't follow that recognizing them, however, that I find them any more valid than they would find mine. You have a different system, and you find my belief system invalid. That's entirely expected. However, what I'm saying, at the most foundational level, if you do not use Christian presuppositions, then you end up making hash out of epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. He didn't respond for a day, so I said, I'm still up for the conversation if you are. I consider it extreme importance with everything. Can't justify it. It doesn't work. Something that I screenshot. There we go. Someone commented this on one of Eli Ayala's videos. Eli Ayala is the director of Revealed Apologetics, great YouTube channel to follow. I strongly recommend it. He's associated with Apologetics Studios now. This is apparently someone claiming to be an atheist on there. He says, my objection is rooted in a worldview where nothing can be certain. I call that worldview reality. His objection is based on a worldview where nothing can be certain. That be reality. Yeah, we
certain of reality.
Say again?
You're not certain of reality.
Exactly. Like, okay, so how can you even call that if you're not certain of it?
Anything in reality. So you just forfeited the argument.
Yep. It's game over at that point. See how easy that was? Like you can't even tell what reality is. He goes on though, you can't prove God with absolute certainty or you wouldn't be making this video and I would not be commenting. You can't prove God with absolute certainty. Actually you can, you just don't like the proof that we offer. Because without God, you can't even make an argument. The atheist continues, my presupposition is that my reality exists as I experience it because I have no choice. And a Christian's presupposition is also that, plus God did it. Not quite. And based on that, he says, go vote for things that directly affect others. He said affect, not affect, but that's okay. Keep your ideology out of my government and I won't care. Oh, really? So we're supposed to let your ideology run government? What makes your ideology better than mine? You already said you can't even be certain about your own reality. Sounds to me like you're just flapping your gums or rattling your fingers across a keyboard or thumbs across a screen. Prove to me empirically that abortion is murder. Prove to me empirically letting trans people exist as trans is ultimately bad for them. Post the evidence in the replies. And unlike most Christians I taught you, I actually read things given to me. Prove to me empirically. And how do you know that empiricism is the only way to know things? You don't. And it's not. He just talked about he has a world where nothing can be certain in reality. He says he already had presuppositions.
Now he wants certain evidence.
Yes, now he wants certain evidence. That doesn't work according to his worldview. And beyond that, he admitted that he had presuppositions. But he also insisted on empirical evidence demonstrations. So can we pick up one of your presuppositions and analyze it? You can't observe that empirically. You can't see it, taste it, touch it, hear it, smell it. But you claim to have it. Once again, it doesn't comport. We talked about that earlier. Tension in his epistemology and his metaphysic. Presuppositions that will not comport with the other ones that he claims. But here you're living in a realm of contradiction, but you don't see it. that's when you start asking the question, like, okay, you just said that you can't be certain of reality, so why are we having this conversation? As a Christian, I can tell you why we're having this conversation. The truth doesn't. Reality does matter, and it's important to convince people of the truth. Say again?
Maybe he didn't know he's having that conversation.
Maybe he did. Maybe it was a dream, right? A little bit of Descartes.
This
Oh, what
is
is
not a
happening? How many drinks did he have that afternoon, right? Pass me another beer. But people make those kind of statements, and it's just like, okay, wait a minute. If what the first thing you said, if that really is true, then the rest of anything either of us says doesn't matter at all. It's just brain gas. So what?
Or the opposite, everything all of you say is true and matters the most. Because reality is subjective and untenable.
Well, because then you just end up with contradictions. And once you accept contradictions, then you can prove anything, and it becomes absurd in a hurry. It falls apart. It doesn't work. You can't think that way. You can't reason that way. You certainly can't act that way. Proof is in the pudding, they like to say. You actually act consistent with what you're claiming. Kind of like the math teacher who's going to fail the student, even though he says that everything is conditioned on being. It doesn't work. All right. We got into C just a little bit. That'll wet your whistle for consequences. Because all of those things are the consequences of unbelieving thought. And next week we're going to talk about how to uncover them. And we're going to use Proverbs 26 to do it. Any other questions or comments? All right, then. Let's pray, and then we'll dismiss, I suppose. It's about 5 minutes till, so we're good. Lord God, thank you for a wonderful class, for this important information. I pray that you would help us to think clearly and that we would be able to uncover arbitrariness, inconsistencies, contradictions, undesired consequences, and other things as we talk to our friends and neighbors about their way of viewing the world, about the reality of Jesus Christ, who is God over all, who is indeed necessary in order to make sense out of these things. I pray that you would use those things that you put into our lives now. Be able to destroy arguments of any kind that would set themselves up against you. The opportunity for the gospel to share to take its place that we return to the rest. Give us confidence as we pray in Jesus' name. All right.